Let's talk about ethnicity in Central America. Most people in Central America are indeed mestizos. However, not every country in Central America is majority mestizo. The four middle countries are majority mestizo, and they are Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica. Here's a map. You can see that I've circled them for you. That means that the other three countries in Central America are not. Which are those three countries? Guatemala and Belize in the north, and Panama in the south. Here's a map showing them. I'm actually going to speak about the countries that are the anomalies, the three countries that are not majority mestizo, and I'm going to begin with Guatemala. About half the population in Guatemala is indigenous. These people are the descendants of the Maya, just like the people in the Yucatan are the descendants of the Maya. Now, how did these indigenous people survive the conquest? When I told you that in order for indigenous people to survive, they needed to remain isolated. Well, remember, the Maya collapsed about 1400. And as the Spanish were coming around the coast of Central America and into Mexico, their interest was much more in the great civilizations that were still surviving, the Aztecs, and then in South America, the Inca, than they were in indigenous people running around the jungles. As a result of that, they left these indigenous people overwhelmingly alone, and they survived and did not die of all the diseases that were brought over from the New World. The other half of the population in Guatemala are what in Guatemala they call Ladino. Ladino is anybody who's not indigenous. So people of European ancestry, mestizos, even though mestizos are indigenous, they aren't counted really as indigenous people in Guatemala, and people of African ancestry. Because of this, Guatemala experiences something called cultural pluralism. Cultural pluralism happens when two separate cultures exist side by side, but they have nothing to do with each other. The indigenous people in Guatemala speak indigenous languages. They dress as indigenous people dress in a traditional way. As you can see with this woman, you see indigenous people throughout Guatemala dressed like this. This has nothing to do with tourism. If you're in Germany and you see somebody in lederhosen, that's so that you can take a picture of them. When you're in Guatemala and you see people dressed like this is because the indigenous people identify themselves based on these very complicated patterns. And so the indigenous people are going to dress like that. The rest of the population doesn't. So there's a very visual thing and a very auditorial thing with language. Here's Guatemala. If you look carefully at Guatemala, you can see that there are a number of towns and cities that have Tenango at the end, the suffix of the name. Like up in the north, you can see Tenango. Then on the left-hand side in the west, you can see Quetzaltenango. Down at the bottom in the southwest, you can see Matzaltenango. You can see in the middle Chichicastenango, and you can see over on the right-hand side, which is the southeast, Chimaltenango. All of these towns with Tenango are indigenous towns, and there are many more. If you look on the bottom right-hand corner, the southern part of the map, you can see Antigua. Antigua is famous for some of the most high-quality coffee on earth. Belize is next, right next door. Ethnicity in Belize is a complicated thing. It's a difficult thing to answer what you are in Belize in a lot of ways, and this has to do with a history of the way people identify because of racism. So what I'm going to tell you, remember, is steeped in a kind of history of racism that's happened in Central America and, frankly, throughout the world. Something like 35 to 50% of the population in Belize is of African ancestry. Now, Belize was a British colony. It's kind of unusual in that way. Because of that, the majority of people speak English and Creole languages. Creole is a mix of all of these languages in the Caribbean zone. So English and French and Spanish and indigenous languages, even African mixes in there. In addition to that, there are various indigenous languages spoken in Belize, and Spanish is spoken in some places in Belize. Now, the British were not Catholics, of course, and so the majority of people in Belize are Protestants. Belize has a strong tourism sector, and it's a growing tourism sector. This is overwhelmingly in the coastal zone, and you can see that Belize has a long coast, and out on the islands. The islands are called cays. A big reason for this is because Belize is next to one of the world's largest barrier reefs. And so it's an excellent place for snorkeling and scuba diving, and that draws adventurous people down to Belize to enjoy those activities. Panama is the third of these three countries. Ethnicity in Panama is a very mixed thing. It also has been seasoned by long historic racism. But about 25% of the population, by almost anybody's count, is of African ancestry. And if these people did ancestry DNA throughout Panama, we would probably find that 75% of the population has African ancestry, especially the Panamanian population that has been in the country for generations. Of course, Panama is famous for the Panama Canal, which you can see here. Because of the Panama Canal, it's also an important banking center in Central America. It has one of the strongest economies in Central America because of a combination of the banking and the canal. And strangely enough, Panama uses the US dollar as its currency. Let's take a closer look at Panama as a physical place. So here's Panama. And on the left-hand side, you can see a picture of the reconstruction of the Panama Canal. Because the Panama Canal was built 100 years ago, the ships have gotten significantly larger. And so the Panama Canal, during the beginning part of the 21st century, was being reconstructed. This has now been completed. And if you look, here's Panama City. This is the Panama Canal.